Alrighty, so we have some conference projection issues. So we all look at our laptops right now. You can see the blue screen in the background, so it's not really helping our case. But basically, we want to look at two HTTP client issues before we go over the other ones. David, you have a preference for which one first? The proxy one,
proxy
right?
one first.
Let me just...
Is Stephen on the call?
No. Tanner and Jeremy are both on the call.
All right, then I can also talk. We had Stephen open up the other one for us. So, you want me to summarize? Or?
Yeah,
okay. So, there's a lot of information here, but basically what we're trying to do is replace the fact that we don't have app config anymore. We don't have a way for people to configure a proxy with app config, or even say they want to use default credentials. So we have a lot of blocking issues already where people can't even do NuGet restore, because it uses HTTP client, because they're on a corporate network that uses default credentials requiring on a proxy, and there's no way to tell any of the components they should do that. So basically, we're trying to replace app config, which we don't have in .NET Core generally. And we're also trying to replace a common pattern that people used in the framework, which was a method called web request. That was the actual type default web proxy, which was the static property. We moved away from all of the web request classes because we considered those legacy. They're part of our system net requests namespace type library. So basically what we need to do is add back something that enables customers to latch on to what the default proxy is. And the default proxy now is cross-platform, so it's not just WinINet settings on Windows. It can be environment variables. We've also enabled environment variables for Windows as well, so they get the same experience across all the platforms, OS X, Linux, etc. So this kind of completes the rest of the puzzle for global proxy config. It enables them to set just credentials if that's what their environment is, or have a hard-coded proxy, which a lot of customers did in the existing app config.
Right. We
already have an existing schema that the framework had for systemnet, a lot of interesting things, and people keep complaining, where is that, where is that? Mm-hmm. There's a plan that someone else can write a compat layer that basically will parse the old style XML file or JSON file or whatever people want, but we need an API mechanism in core that could enable those scenarios, because of course we don't have a direct config replacement in core. So anyway, this is really what this property is all about, and kind of completes our enterprise authentication scenarios for proxies, so that someone can inject the credentials using this default proxy. There's a credentials property on it, or they can inject a separate proxy. It also helps the problem with when they don't control the HTTP client. We have a lot of components being built now, like HTTP Client Factory and a whole bunch of other stuff that's making these HTTP clients for everybody, and they don't have direct control. And the one thing they want to be able to control is being on a network that's not under their control. So they need to inject sort of a little bit of configuration, and this is how they're going to do it. And it's very similar to the pattern we have in Framework. It's just on a different type with a slightly different name.
So I had a little bit of confusion about what you just said. So you had mentioned that in the past in full framework, we would be able to, through appconfig, specify proxy settings. Did you say that the intent here was also to allow something similar to that, or to allow, or is the idea going to be that if I'm an application developer, I should, at app start, read a value from somewhere and then call this property setting?
No, if you're an app developer, you can use this API directly.
Okay.
But there will be customers that say, we have components that we like defining app config, and you guys, we wrote a thing that'll parse app config and kind of emulate everything it did. We just need APIs to make it work.
Okay.
And now they have an API to make it work.
So inside the NuGet client, for instance, the NuGet client would have to have code inside of it, which reads the proxy settings from some file and then calls into this API.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that will enable them to do this. Without it, they just say nothing works.
But it sounds like it's going to be on the individual library or app developer instead of something that the framework itself will provide as a first-class thing.
Yes, because Core no longer provides as a first-class citizen a config mechanism.
Okay. Okay.
So what instance so how do I set this? Like, I mean, it seems
I gave some examples. I gave some examples under.
So you would have to implement web proxy then, right? Because we don't ship a public implementation. Is that fair?
No, you don't implement it. You do a get, and you automatically get something useful. You automatically get the proxy that's defined on the system settings on the platform. It's basically it's an object model of what's already defined on the platform. And now we have a mechanism, like there's two basic use cases I put in the sample API usage part of this issue right here. There's the case where I just want to use what's defined already on the machine, like iNet settings and the IE, or in OS X, there's Mac settings, or on Linux, I have environment variables, or maybe I have environment variables on the other machines too. But there's no way for me to say I want to use default credentials. So I need a place to inject that. And this is the mechanism. So default proxy, the default value, the initial value of this property is non-null, and it represents an object that you can set the existing properties on. It already this property exposes the iWeb proxy interface that's already defined in the framework and core, and it has a mechanism that you can just, as you see, just set credentials. And now once you do that one line, now it will use the system proxy, but now it will be able to carry the using credentials and get through the authenticating proxy. That's the one important use case. The other use case is that I want to override that setting, and here's the injection of my class called myCustomProxy, which also implements the standard iWeb proxy interface. Yeah. Those are the two key use cases that we see everywhere.
So that's why you have a property setter then, not just a getter, because
there is a getter. No, there's a getter.
Well, no, but I mean, this is why you also have a setter. Right?
Yes, that's why.
Because I want to replace the whole thing.
I want to replace the whole thing. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
And then, so from your bullet points, you said on Linux, if no environment variables are set, then null is returned.
So I was describing. So what I was describing here is irrespective of us doing this API. This is what we've now enabled in .NET Core as of 3.0 in the master branch, where we have a consistent mechanism for because environment variables had been a very traditional way on Linux. And customers also were asking for, I want it to work the same on Windows too, because I have all these Docker containers. So as part of broadening the scenario, we made environment variables work in a consistent way. You have environment variables that are a certain set defined, it will use that as the basis of the platform proxy definition. But environment variables alone don't capture the credentials that you want to inject. So all I was describing here is how else is this used with the rest of the mechanisms that we've already enabled in core. So we have a consistent story now. If you have Docker containers or whatever, which sort of inject these environment variables for you. And so now we have a very consistent story with what the definition of the system proxy settings mean, even on Windows. And now we have this mechanism where you can inject either the credentials, or in some cases, do a replacement of it, because customers may have a fixed class that they wrote that they want to inject a proxy configuration. Those were the two use cases that have traditionally been used in frameworks.
So the environment variables are automatically hooked up then?
Yes, yeah, we already did that change recently.
Is there a way to disable hookup of environment variables for people who don't want global mutating state? Because that's been a problem with like MS Build and stuff before, where HP went and defined a platform environment variable that they shipped on their laptops, and then MS Build broke.
If people want to disable the environment variables typically are not defined.
Okay.
By default, they're not defined.
So we define what the name is?
We use the same naming pattern that curl and everyone else used, so like HTTP_proxy, HTTPS_proxy, no proxy, and all of that. So, and by default, they're not there.
Right, but
they can be created there in the process or whatever.
But what I was asking is there a way to configure HTTP client to say don't use the environment variables even if they exist?
I'll turn that question and say, is there a way to configure HTTP client not to use a system configured proxy? That's the way I'll turn your question around, because the environment variables are just another way of saying I have WinINet settings, which also say use a proxy. So is there a way in HTTP client to say don't use system proxy settings? And the answer to that is yes. In general, HTTP client has a mechanism when you create an instance of it to say use proxy false. And it's not going to use any proxy at all, no matter what. Adding this is also now an additional mechanism, because you could inject a default proxy with the setter, and your my proxy Custom proxy basically is no proxy. You define the bypass setting, and now you don't use a proxy for anything. So yes.
Okay. And then my other question is, have we checked with ASP.NET and made sure that this will work sufficiently for them with their app settings JSON that they already have?
We've talked to ASP.NET in the sense of they can use this mechanism if they want and call it. Their app settings JSON right now, I mean, they may have defined their own schema. If they want to enable config-like things to sort of replicate the XML schema we had in app config, web config, they can. They can define whatever they want it to be. Hopefully it'll be similar, and they can use this API to make it work.
Okay.
There already a proxy on HttpClient instance.
Yes, by default, HTTP client, when you create an instance of HTTP client, the use proxy is true, and it will use the system proxy.
No, I mean, is there an iWeb proxy property on HTTP?
Yes, there is.
Yeah, there's a proxy property.
Yeah.
Oh, Steve's online. Right.
I hadn't made it that far since we don't have the API on the screen. Okay, so this is the static, and then when you create a new HTTP client, the static gets used as the default value, or as the default value in the instance.
Yes, effectively.
Okay.
Yes, unless you override the proxy property with something else at the instance layer.
Yeah. That's
So what's the behavior if you set the property to null?
what it throws.
Oh,
Okay.
I don't want this property set to null.
Okay.
So you shouldn't have it return null on Linux.
It will never return null. Even if you didn't define any environment variables, it will still return this object. But the object will have sort of the side effect of it's bypass true always.
Okay.
Effectively.
I see.
Just your statement here, or at least the issue statement, the default value of this property on Linux, if environment variables are not set, null is returned.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess what I meant.
A no proxy is
Yeah.
returned.
We can. So we can decide. That was sort of an implementation behavior. We were trying to figure out what made sense, because either way. The issue with Linux right now is Linux is the one OS platform where we don't have two choices of system proxy settings. On Windows, we have environment variables, and if they're not there, we'll use IE settings, which, of course, IE settings may result in no proxy either. And then the same for OS X. We can still choose. This is sort of what we think is confusing or not. If you get the null, I guess is the issue, do we want to make sure if developers try to set a credentials property on it and it's really null, it'll throw, and we sort of just want it to be a no op.
I would say if your setter is going to reject no, your getter is never allowed to return.
Yeah. And we can definitely and we can definitely do that, and we can return an object that's non-null, but its effect is that for every URI you want to go to, you're effectively bypassing a proxy, and that's fine, and that's a consistent story, and I can roll that in there
So
as well. But that makes sense, yeah. If you can't set it to null, you don't want it to return
so essentially
null.
when nullability
Yeah.
gets around to this one, this
Yeah.
should say that it is not null.
Yeah, because it really is the same thing. Even on Windows with the framework, the default proxy on web request was non-null, even if IE settings had all the boxes unchecked. Or IE settings said, I'd like to discover a pack file, and of course there wasn't one on the network. So it would still return a non-null object, but the effect was you never went through a proxy. So that's fine. I can we can do that. And then we have a consistent story. It's never null when you get it, and you can't set it to null.
So how much work is it for me to implement the interface? It's only 3 members, but how do I implement them? We don't have a default one you can derive from, right? You just have to literally implement it from
No, we do actually. We have a web proxy class that people can use, and it's a sort of a simple kind of class, and you can give it some interesting little parameters when you create it. It actually has a history of, there's some brokenness in it, and I didn't really even want to attach anything more to that class. We have it for compatibility. We have some other weird methods related to it that return instances of web proxy instead of an interface in iWeb proxy, which we didn't want to do, but there's a lot of interesting historic 15-plus-year-old comments in framework that say, wow, this was really broken, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, that answers your question. Yeah, if developers don't even want to implement the 3 methods of iWeb proxy for a custom proxy, sure, they can just use the web proxy class for a quick and dirty thing.
It's also possible if they wanted to be able to delegate to existing behavior. In some cases, they could always grab default proxies from its getter and wrap that in their own iWeb proxy. So if they wanted to say, I want to use the settings except when I'm going to URL blah, then they can say if URL equals blah, else the captured default proxy dot get proxy.
Yeah, they could. Everything we've seen historically when people write their own class that implements iWeb proxy, it's pretty simple, and sometimes it's like 10 lines, and they have no problem building their own little one.
Makes sense. I mean, one person was asking in the chat, if it's not null, how do I determine that I'm using a proxy or not?
So, I mean, that's a good question in the sense of in general, you don't know for sure if you're using a proxy unless you call the get proxy method of the proxy with a destination URI, and it returns whether you're being bypassed or not. We're basically returning an object model of something that represents the settings that tells you, like, this is how you can figure out if your destination URI actually goes through a proxy. Many times, if you're on a corporate network, there's a JavaScript pack file that got fetched, and it's got a complicated algorithm for figuring out, for certain URIs, you're going through proxy 1. For certain URIs, you're going through proxy 2. For other URIs, you're going direct. And so to answer the question about whether you're going through a proxy depends on what URI you're providing. So it's really a function. It's an argument passed to a function. And but you could tell if you are actually, since we're always returning a non-null object, you can call the isBypassed method of it with your destination URI, and you'll know whether or not, if you're using the system proxy, whether or not that URI goes through a proxy or not. That's the answer to that question. Of course, if
this API also doesn't really change that answer. I mean, like when you create an HTTP client today, the proxy property is initialized to something, and all this API is doing is allow you to override what that something is.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think the question from Frederick was probably more along the lines of, like, if you're on Linux, no environment variables are configured, and the environment settings are basically saying don't use a proxy, then the instance we're giving you is basically a null instance, right? It basically just says don't do anything. And how would you know that? And the answer from you would be, you shouldn't special case that. You should just generally assume,
Yeah, right. You would get that property, say, and you'd call isBypassed, which returns a Boolean, and you give it a URI, and every URI you give it, it returns true.
Right. Alrighty. So any more concerns with this one?
So my only question is purely about naming, and I don't have an agenda here. It's just a question. Every other property on HTTP client controls that instance's behavior, whereas I think this is the first static we're talking about adding to HTTP client. So we should be sure that this is where we actually want to put it. And then, from a naming perspective, default probably makes sense. But the next API we're looking at, I propose that it also be prefixed with default, but it's actually being proposed as an instance, and it's affecting something where that also makes sense. But now we're going to have two defaults that both make sense for their own thing, but one of them being a static and one of them being an instance. So I just want to maybe we should review both.
Yeah. So
both.
Looks like there's already an instance starting with default.
There's the default request headers on HTTP client. I mean, if we don't like default proxy, I use the word default because historically we had default web proxy on the web request method. We could also use system proxy, or platform. Platform's kind of not a great word. I don't know if system's a great word.
I'm actually okay with default. I just want to make sure that holistically, when we look at everything, it all.
I thought it was the least bad of all names, and not. It was also discoverable more because people would be looking to ask about web request default web proxy, and we're telling them, well, web HTTP client is the thing you should be thinking about using now, and so I thought it was more discoverable.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I would say at all based off Steve's raising the point is, should this be on a separate class called something like HTTP client defaults, so that if you have other static defaults in the future, there's sort of, these are the globals and then these are the instances.
So,
and
Yeah, so
and
I
then
thought
next
about that, and it sort of brought me back to the horror of Service Point Manager, which was the other sort of global class that then everything else depended on. And I sort of thought, like, I didn't want to go there. And so that's why I thought that it was more discoverable to just put it on the thing that's 99% you're using it with.
Right.
So that's why I wanted it on HTTP Client.
Would HTTP Client Factory make more sense or less sense?
HTTP Client Factory is not a .NET Core class. It's something that got created as a workaround for the fact that our HTTP stack doesn't do true TTL timeouts of, on DNS and connections, and it was created as a nice workaround. But eventually, we expect HTTP Client Factory not to be needed once we improve our stack to be more aware of like time to live on DNS records and stuff.
We don't really have a static type then with like some ambient state or anything like that, right? So in that sense, it's probably the best place to put it. I mean, unless you want to cook up a new type, but that seems a little bit over the top for one property.
I didn't want to create a new replacement for Service Point Manager.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, just the point being that there's already the default request headers, which is instance. Steve wants to add default request version, which is instance. And then we'd have default proxy, which is static. So now you can't, like, because IntelliSense doesn't, as far as I can recall, doesn't really distinguish between instance and static. You're on an instance of the thing and you hit dot and you see all the defaults. But what you really wish is that it only showed you the static ones on the static type and the instance on the instance.
I believe that's what C# does, actually.
Yeah.
I don't think it lets you call static methods off of an instance.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that something we can fix with tooling?
I guess if
I think C# literally
remembering
gives you an
wrong
error
about what
message if you
IntelliSense
try
does.
to invoke a static on an instance.
well,
I don't think it compiles.
but
I think IntelliSense also filters them out. I think the problem is more if you want to have an instance method and a static method with the same name, because that doesn't fly. Because IL doesn't support that. Because they're not different namespaces in IL. But I think in C# they're separate namespaces. But I agree with Stephen, like, from the point of view, like, it's the first one. Do we want to set that? I mean, what if we do other things like default proxy? Like, is this a good place to put it? If so, then let's do it. If we believe it's not, then let's not, because it's the first time we do this. But I don't think we have a better place to put it.
yeah, I think it's fine.
Yeah, it gives you explicitly member X cannot be accessed with instance reference. Qualify it with a type name instead.
Yeah.
But did IntelliSense suggest it to you?
No.
Okay, then that's fine.
That would be bad IntelliSense. Here,
Right, that would be an IntelliSense bug.
I thought it did, and that it just had the S thing on it, and when you did it, then it tried suggesting that you change the left side to be that, like, I thought it was trying to be overly helpful, from my recollection. Maybe we fixed that version.
Yeah, maybe. All right, so then let's approve this guy. If I find the right tab now in my little disaster that I set up myself here. All right, so one down. All right, now let's talk about HTTP client default request version. Let me actually mirror this on the other end as well. Surprisingly difficult.
I thought we had talked about this before. Maybe not.
I don't think so.
No.
Oh, okay.
Maybe something similar. So the issue here, the idea here is HTTP client it's a thin wrapper around an HTTP client or an HTTP message invoker, which just provides the send async method, and you give it an HTTP request message and it sends it off. HTTP client wraps that with some helpful functionality. There's also a send async that just kind of goes directly through to the handler, but it layers on functionality like some nice helpers for just saying, just get string async, like get me the whole contents, the response is a string. So just a one-shot call, or get bytes async, or it allows you to have it handle buffering the response if you don't want to do it yourself, and so on. All of those helpers, though, because they're sort of this one-shot thing layered on top of that send async, they end up creating that HTTP request message for you. So they rather than you saying var m equals new HTTP request message, configure it however you want, and then pass it off to send async, HTTP client does that on your behalf. HTTP request message has a version property on it that controls the protocol version that the underlying handler uses. So if you specify 1.1, you'll be using HTTP 1.1. If you specify 2.0, you're asking for the handler to do HTTP 2. But with HTTP client creating that message for you, you have no way to control what version it sets it to. And that's a pretty important thing to be able to control. So what this would be is just like HTTP client has default request headers, or whatever the property is called, where basically when it creates one of these request messages, it populates the headers with whatever you specified in that collection on HTTP client. This does the same thing. When it creates a request message for you, it will populate the version with the version you specify. Now, there is one small difference, and it's worth talking about, and that is, for better or worse, the way that default request headers property is implemented today, it adds those to every message that you send, regardless of whether it creates the message for you or not. Whereas this default request version would really be a default. If it's creating the message for you, it's going to set it. But if you just give it an HTTP request that you recreated, it wouldn't touch the version at all. We could talk about that. There are other options, but that's how I currently have it defined.
So everything you just said sounds really familiar. I swear to God, we have talked about setting the default version.
Yeah, that's what confused me.
So I'll tell you the background of this is we thought a year ago maybe we were going to come here with opt-in, opt-out. We were adding HTTP2 feature, and we thought maybe we'd have a version. And then actually we had a conversation about it at the time, and we actually had it in a different format, and it was decided we're not ready to have this API because we don't know, why are we adding it? Is it because we want to opt in, we want to opt out? And so it was decided then, if you just want to play around with the experimental then at the time, HTTP2, then use app context, use an environment variable, just allow people to try it out and come back to us later when you have an API. So now we're coming back with an API. And that's kind of why there's a deja vu going on here about this.
Yeah, I thought there was some issue that I think we discussed at some point where somebody suggested adding a default member to HTTP version, which would basically be in max value, and then it would just use the highest version that's available on a given platform, which might be 2.0 for some and 1.1 for others. And I think we rejected that one. I think that might be because we talked about that one. But yeah, I've definitely... Yeah, I think I have no problems with that. That seems like a reasonable way to do it.
Yeah, so I just want to say the other thing that we've learned with using HTTP2 and having customers try it out is we don't want to have the default as 2.0. So one of the things that we did last year or the year before is we tweaked one of our classes, HTTP request message, and we said, let's make the default version property be 2.0, and then maybe stuff will just light up. And it actually works that way for UAP, and we're going to leave that behavior for UAP in master. And what we discovered is that, well, there's some things that we don't want to make HTTP2 the default. The NT-auth authentication kind of works in some differences. And so we decided that the default initial value should be 1.1, but we need an easy mechanism to allow people to turn it on when they need it for gRPC and other reasons. And so this has sort of been the learnings that led up to what Stephen wrote here in the proposal for this property. Allow an easy mechanism to turn on HTTP2. The reason why we want a property on HTTP client is that many of its methods, you don't pass in an HTTP request message. You just say, I want to do a get async to this URI. And so the question is, well, who's creating the internal HTTP request message that has the version property? Well, it's HTTP client. It's doing a convenience for you. So for customers that just use the less convenient way, they use a send async call of HTTP client where you create an HTTP request message. They can create it with whatever they want. It defaults to say 1.1, but they can simply set the version property. And for that request, it's going to use whatever version they want. But this property is mainly useful for the 80% case that use the convenience methods of HTTP client where they're not creating a separate request message.
Right.
And we need a way for HTTP client to do a good job at deciding what that default should be since they're not creating it directly.
Right.
And that's the motivation for this property on HTTP client instance.
Didn't you push for this, Jeremy? I think at some point in the meeting, I think you said, like, because I don't get to set the default, we should have a
Yeah, if we look back at the recording,
I think
he said
that sounds very familiar. The only question I have is, like, do we think that, like, instance is the only scope that makes sense? Because, like, we don't want the global setting to say, if you have an HTTP client, what do you want the default for that to be?
We discussed it. I discussed it. I kind of proposed it originally with Stephen in our smaller team meeting, and then we kind of went back and forth on it and goes, well, the problem with a global setting like that is you would be affecting like maybe a library that's creating HTTP these messages, and that could really change things the way the library maybe isn't tested for that. It's different than like injecting proxy settings, which are environmental. This is injecting, this is kind of changing what the library wants to create. And so injecting it at the static layer, we decided, nah, not a good idea. So this is why it's an instance method.
That's a good point, because to what David just said, you would actually be implicitly changing the library's contract with the server it's trying to call.
Yeah.
To be clear, I'm not suggesting doing it. All I'm saying is that if we take the property as is, if we ever want to add the static layer, well, we out of names.
Well, then it'd be.
I think if we wanted to add the static layer, we would add it as David had previously proposed to HTTP request message itself.
Yeah.
Yes, that was what I proposed. I had originally proposed as part of this having a static property on request message itself, which sort of just changes every request message that anybody or any layer makes, use this default instead. But, so we still have that ability if we choose to go down that route. But this, so adding this property as an instance method to HTTP client doesn't mean we can't do the other thing, which we may not want to do.
Well, it depends on the policy you want to have, right? If you want to say that if I knew of an HTTP client, I want the value for the instance default request version to be that one. That may be different from saying everybody who creates a message defaults to that one, right? That's not necessarily the same.
Yes, but you're still injecting something which is totally unexpected on library.
Well, yeah, I'm not suggesting doing that. What I'm saying is that I think if you want the other policy, then I think probably you want. I don't think you want to put it on the other type. You probably will put it on the same type, but under a different name. I don't know.
Maybe what I thought we would end up doing if we did that is we would basically just say that HTTP client its instance default request version is initialized to HTTP request messages static default version.
Oh, fair enough.
I just come to that same.
Yep, that's a good. Yep.
Yeah, we can control what it does.
Because then the instance still wins. It's just it used the other type for its.
That's
default.
Yeah, because this honestly seems like a good compromise for what did you say around the 80% case, most likely. And if we don't see a good reason right now to worry about having a global static, then this one really should get the better name, I think.
Right.
And the name was chosen because we have a default request headers on as an instance property of HTTP client, and so default request version as a similar name as an instance name seems the right name.
That's right.
You ask server to, like, if you send the HTTP2 request and the server doesn't support it, can it downgrade the...
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's in general how HTTP2 works. It first actually does the TLS connection. And in the ALPN, it's kind of saying, hey, I want to do a TLS connection because I want to connect HTTP2. So it's passing that little H2. And then the server, at the TLS layer says, I don't understand this, no way. And then by the time the TLS connection comes back, everyone knows whether or not they're going to be happy talking HTTP2 or not.
Maybe something like request name or something like that. A requested version, sorry. Like if you add the static.
So HTTP client.request version?
Yeah, requested version. Because since it can downgrade it, it means that you
It's
request
just the protocol. I mean, if you create it on the message and you call it like. This is just deciding what it does when it creates the other object that already has this property. Like default seems great.
Because I mean, can't a server negotiate 1.0 instead? Also, even if you say 1.1.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So it's never truly honored anyway.
Yeah.
It's
guess
never
the-
required to be honored.
Yeah, I think the default is basically what do you request by default, right?
Right.
It's still a request, right? So you're not getting guaranteed, but
Right.
that's
Or like
already
preferred
implied by
maybe
the
or
name.
something like.
I just thought the name being similar to default request headers just made more sense when you kind of
Yeah.
bring it up on IntelliSense.
Yeah, I think default makes more sense than preferred.
Default seems
Yeah, it also kind of conveys that it's you can still override it, right? On a per request basis, which kind of conveys that. Yeah, I don't have a problem with the name. Location seems fine. So I think so right now we say defaults to 1.1. What happens if will we ever change this to 2.0, or is this more like well, the web is too broken if you do that, so it's always
you
opted.
said UAP defaults it to 2.0, right?
Okay, so we're not talking about this property in particular, but we're talking about what is the default initial value when I create an HTTP request message. And like I said, we changed it last year to 2.0. We had already changed it 3 years ago for UAP because we didn't have this property on HTTP client, and we wanted a mechanism that would light up what we had done for UAP in the WinINet stack, in the WinRT stack, which was 2.0. And we wanted the majority of customers building apps, for the Windows Store, App Store, when they used the SystemNet HTTP client, which used the WinRT APIs, we wanted them to have instant light up for 2.0 because that was deemed the right choice. And so that's motivated the 2.0 default for request message. And then we generalized that last year as we were doing HTTP2 work to the rest of the .NET Core stack. Now we're kind of reverting part of that decision in the HTTP request message to go back to 1.1, but we'll still leave the ifdef UAP for 2.0 because we didn't want to touch that.
Okay.
And that's kind of how the history of the 1.1 versus 2.0 default goes back and forth.
Yeah, that's just a normal thing you have to think about when defaults change between platforms. So that's, I think, the thing that seems.
Yeah, and also we're talking about now, we're releasing, this is for NetCore 3.0. It's a major version. We thought, like, if we're going to do these kind of things, this is the better time to do it when you change a major version. And like I said, by introducing this property, in addition to us changing the HTTP request message default back to 1.1, by introducing this property, it's a softer landing for anybody that needs HTTP client being 2.0 if they want to use this property on their instance of HTTP client and set it to 2.0. So it's kind of the right way to migrate people to 3.0 and give us a clean way of making HTTP2 work for the gRPC scenarios and everything else.
Yeah, one guy is asking, like, have you thought about HTTP3/Quick? Like, is it, like, I don't know how far, like, is this, will we even use HTTP client in that world, or would it be a different way to talk about it?
Steven, do you want to comment?
I think we would, our ideal would be we would still use HTTP client, and we would have yet another implementation in Sockets HTTP handler that supported, Quick.
Yeah.
That would be the ideal. We haven't actually implemented anything yet to know whether there's anything that would prevent that, although it's the surface area is such that it's hard to see something that would be problematic. Whether we would change the default request version to ever be 3 instead of 1.1, I don't know. I mean, what we've seen with 2.0 is HTTP2 has been out for how long, and still only a minority of the web supports it. And there's lots of differences in implementation, lots of corner cases. I think it would be a long time before we felt comfortable saying everyone has high enough quality on Quick, or HTTP3 rather, that we're going to, effectively force it upon everyone.
Yeah. But with this property being added to HTTP client, we have a very quick mechanism for any other stack consuming core to change it for them, and then the rest of their code will just work at that new request.
Yeah, I think the person is just asking, have you thought about this in API design? I think it's one of two things, right? It either will just be another HTTP version that you can set, in which case the API will work, or HTTP client as an API doesn't work, in which case it doesn't.
Yeah,
matter.
I mean, our goal is definitely that HTTP
other.
client should work the same. I mean, all of these new transports, like HTTP2 and HTTP3, they really don't change the fundamental way that it's still HTTP 1.1 under the covers, the way the messaging works and the headers. There's optimizations, there's compression, etc. And with HTTP3, with Quick, that's like UDP instead of TCP. So there's stuff at that lower networking layer that's mostly optimizations, but the overall concepts about HTTP and methods and headers, and that's all the same. And we believe the object model of HTTP client will still live throughout all of that. We may add little optimizations for things. Even in the gRPC world with getting duplex streaming working, or when you think about push notifications, there's all these little really expert level things that are interesting. And if we need to enhance the HTTP client API for those, we will. But we think HTTP client is general purpose enough that it will continue, because the fundamental building blocks of what you're sending are the same. They haven't changed even with HTTP2, and they're not really changing with HTTP3. So there's still headers, there's still methods, and that's all of what HTTP is about.
Somebody says we have a quick way to implement that. No pun intended. All right. So I think so they're both approved now. So then we have like 7 minutes left. Is there any quick one we can look at?
Yeah. The one with the comment in the name.
So what?
The one with the comment in the name.
The one with
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for stopping by.
Yep.
so Netlink packet and can address.
Oh, that one. I see.
What's the number?
It's,
35143.
now I have to. It can possibly go wrong. Right.
It's just adding values to enum.
Yeah.
Oh. Netlink packet.
Essentially, Linux supports a couple of protocols which you can basically give users for free if we just add those enum values. Like, I specifically mostly care about CAN, the canvas stuff, that basically allows us to use sockets to as a stream when communicating.
Yeah, and it looks like in the description they said non-compliant operating systems just throw existing good exceptions. So.
Is ProtocolFamily and AddressFamily basically the exact same fucking thing?
Not exactly, but mostly yes.
I mean, like if I talk with them, they literally show the exact same set of members.
Yeah.
ProtocolFamily have IPv6?
Well, according to API catalog, they literally have the same contents. It might be that they're a subset on specific platforms, but the union of all is the same.
I don't know on specifics, but they were mostly the same from what I've seen. But as far as I remember, in Unix there were like tiny differences.
Yeah.
Well, it is what it is. I mean, if that's the design of the enum that we currently have, then adding it to both seems reasonable.
ProtocolFamily they both did it. Don't ever do that.
Where is ProtocolFamily used?
Let's find out.
AddressFamily is used in like all the socket APIs, but ProtocolFamily.
Source.net says ProtocolFamily is never used.
I'm checking reference source as well.
Well, I would agree with that.
Aha. So ProtocolFamily is used in for proper reference source. Looks like some DNS lookup stuff.
It all internal use though, right?
Yeah, that's all internal.
So why do we have the enum at all? We should probably kill the enum at this point.
Simply stop supporting it.
It was probably some Windows compat thing originally. Because I swear, like, Windows actually has two different internal
Yeah,
email
I know when you
servers.
create socket on Linux, you have to pass like address family, protocol family, and the protocol.
No, you don't pass ProtocolFamily.
I thought there were 3 values. I'm pretty sure there were 3 values.
There are, but ProtocolFamily isn't one of them.
Well, seems like an API we should maybe deprecate.
It's AddressFamily, socket type, and protocol type.
Oh,
But it does ship in systemnet sockets since 2.0, so I don't think it was coming from the compat pack. Well, in any case, I think like that seems fine. I mean, like I don't have problems with the. I mean, the protocols are called Netlink, Packet, and CAN.
But it's not called CAN.
What is it
It's
called?
called CAN all caps. The name of it is Controller Area Network, and we should just call it Controller Area Network because we don't overly acronym things.
That seems fine with me. Like I don't have problems with that. And there's a bunch of other protocols that seem like abbreviations already. So
Shouldn't we name it the same thing that like other C libraries have named it? Just no.
We should name it what its name is. Like if C libraries call it just CAN, well, for one, they're probably naming it CAN in all caps, and we would say don't have 3 capital letters consecutively.
Okay, sure.
But like I think that this is just the name of its controller area network, or you see the CAN in all caps, or you see the Pascal case for CAN, and if you know that you're looking for it, you would find it, and if you don't want it, you don't see it. But if it just says like AddressFamily.can, like I can certainly, given that that is a word in English that means this is a possibility, I can see a lot of people being like, oh, maybe that's a discover or something. So like the fact that that works out to be a word is
unfortunate.
Yeah, so I think that we should just call it Controller Area Network, and if somebody doesn't like that word being long, they can make their own const.
I mean, looking at the other entries, I think either one would work, but I think the concern that it is actually legal English word is totally fair. So let's just, let me just type this in then if I find the right window again.
Yeah, and then I'm not entirely sold on packet, but I don't see a better name for it. Like they're all packet, just one of these is more packet than the other.
Well, what is it called? Like, I mean, it says Linux packet, but what does it mean? Is that an actual thing, or is that just a convention or something? Is this an actual protocol? I don't know.
So Linux calls it AF packet, address family packet. It says packet sockets are used to receive or send raw packets at the device driver level. So I don't know if we should call it raw packet, or we can't call it packet socket because it's only a packet socket after you've used the address family packet. And I don't know if we call it Linux packet, or but it seems a very unfortunate name for whoever chose it in I guess like 1980. All terrible names came from 1980. Great. Am I older than that? Yeah, I'm older than that. Didn't just impugn my mother.
I'm looking at winsock.h right now to try to figure out where this came from.
All right, so then is there anything else? So you basically said, so packet, should we rename it or should we leave it as is?
I can't think of a better, different name from it, but that's just from like 30 seconds of looking at a man page. I think it's an unfortunately generic name, but that may be simply the name of it. But like searching for AF packet, you get, what's the difference between AF packet and AF INET? They both do packets.
All right, then let's go with that one.
Oh, yeah, packet.
Let me approve this guy. And then I think we're done for today. Alrighty.
I have one quick question.
Yep.
Is it a breaking change to make a parameter, to give an existing parameter a default value?
Shouldn't be.
No, it could be a source breaking change if they're unfortunately conflicting, but definitely not a binary breaking change. And even on the source side, if the source breaking change is rare enough, I wouldn't care. I would take it probably.
Okay.
By conflicting emo, do you mean if there was a one parameter shorter overload with a different? No,
well, if you have no overloads, it's definitely not a source breaking change. It's more like if you have existing other overloads and somebody could have passed the Like if basically the other one would know the, like it depends on what the prefix effectively is. I mean, if you know omit this, which one now wins out.
Okay.
All right, then that's it for today.
Yeah, I'm going through the Windows header files, and it says protocol families, same as